Back in August, I did an episode on Illinois, and essentially what I said was I genuinely believe that this team had all the makings of being possibly in the college football playoff. And for football or cover Illinois football, hopefully, there was a lot of reasons for that. I'd say first and foremost, Luke Altmayer was being able to bounce off of last season. He's the type of guy that is a brilliant leader. He's super poised. He's not necessarily someone that's going to light up the stat sheet, but he's very efficient. And I think you can see that in his completion percentage, which is about almost 70%. And when you go for 21 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, I mean, that just conceptualizes exactly what Illinois is really good at, which is being gritty, being tough, being determined, being efficient, and playing physical. And I think you saw that in a lot of different games this year. Now, I'm not necessarily going to say, for example, about the Indiana game where they lost by 50, but I think you could look at a couple other examples this year where that narrative really kind of drives home. I would say, at least for me, that in the middle of and towards the end of September, where they beat at the time the number 121 ranked USC 34-32, which at least for me was one of the funner games this year, where Luke Altmayer threw for 328 yards. And overall, I think that was kind of that game that, at least from my perspective, it seemed like that could have been the game that could have led them to possibly a 10-win season. Because let's say, even if they beat USC and they lost to Ohio State, it really kind of seems like that they could have built more momentum to go into that Washington game, even though, as I've said on this show before, Washington is one of the toughest places to play in the country. But in any event, when I look at this Illinois team, they finished 8-4 this year, 5-4 in conference play, which definitely is a little bit of a shock. But when you have a couple losses versus Washington, and obviously versus Wisconsin towards the end of the year, which, by the way, shout out to Wisconsin. They had a couple of ranked wins towards the end of the season, so good for them to kind of shove it everyone's face, because everyone was giving them shit about Luke Fickell staying. But nevertheless, I mean, this Illinois team can be fun to watch, in my opinion. I love to watch teams that that value player development. Like, for example, the emergence of Hudson Clement and Gabe Jacobs and Matthew Bailey and Hank Beatty, all these different guys who have been really great contributors for this Illinois program for a number of seasons now. But I think it's also noteworthy too that Illinois had a pretty tough schedule this year. I mean, when you had to play Indiana, you had to play USC, you had to play Ohio State, and you also played, Duke on the road too, who, by the way, is in the AC championship game. So I definitely want to give them credit as well when it's deserved. But I think a couple points that was kind of missing with Illinois is they couldn't really get their rushing attack going enough for it to be a legitimate weapon for them. Now, I think Khalil Valentine, who ended up being their leading rusher, who just rushed for over 500 yards this year, and they also have Caden Vaughn too, so they kind of had a committee at the running back room. But I think if you're Bret Bielema, you have to really prioritize keeping Valentine, because I think especially when Illinois has to go after a new quarterback, presumably in the transfer portal, you're going to have to find some different ways to utilize this kid. He's shifty, he's crafty, he's really fast, and I'm telling you, I think if they can get creative in terms of the usage for him, I just am very high on this kid, and somebody that you should be on the lookout for if you're an Illinois fan. But nevertheless, I think one of the issues that they kind of struggled with this year, aside from just playing some top ranked opponents and not necessarily always being able to be as balanced on offense, is I think the offensive line didn't really do Luke Altmayer a lot of favors. I mean, he got sacked 31 times this year. I think there are a lot of key critical moments where I think that offensive line kind of let them down a little bit. I mean, I go back and I think of that Washington game, for example, and I think one of the reasons why that happened is that Washington defense was just really able to get pressure in a whole lot of different creative ways. And I think in hindsight, that kind of derailed any sort of momentum that they had going, at least initially at the beginning of the game. But the good news that you have going for you is Illinois just capped off the year going 8-4 for the first time in quite a while, that they're able to bounce back, and assuming that they win their bowl game, having back-to-back 9-win seasons. And that's really a testament to what Bret Bielema is currently building at Illinois. And I know in the day and age of college football playoffs, everybody wants to talk about the playoff. Everybody wants to talk about who gets in, who gets out, being 10-2. But especially at Illinois, when you think at some of the head coaches that they've had before, the Lovie Smiths of the world, the Tim Beckmans of the world, Ron Zooks, I think you have to be happy about what you're seeing with Bielema. I know he's not the guy, he's not the flashiest guy. He's not the type of guy that's going to necessarily get you a bunch of headlines, but what he is going to get you is relatively consistency. He's a guy that's going to give you some identity, and he's a guy who's well experienced and well respected within the Big Ten. And I think if you're an Illinois team who has had struggles being consistent and relevant in an ever so big Big Ten, I think it's something you have to be excited about. And I think that excitement definitely translated towards signing day, where Illinois, they tied their historic high. Their recruiting class right now ranks 22nd in the country, which is tied with Ron Zook's 2007 and 2008 classes, which also ranked both 22nd. And Illinois also finished sixth within the Big Ten, which is the first time they've done that since 2007 and 2008. And I think one thing too, before I get into it too much, is two things. One, Illinois is a total of 30 commits, which is super impressive no matter what school you're at too. But also the fact that Illinois is spending a lot more time within in-state recruiting. They signed 2 top 10 in-state prospects, Nick Hankins, the defensive back, and also a wide receiver, and Naseed Rankin, which I think they're definitely going to need some wide receiver help as well. But in any event, you have to be excited about what you're seeing in terms of this Illinois program, because, especially when you look back and see some of Bret Bielema's recruiting compared to Lovie Smith, for example, it's night and day. And just to give a little bit of context, I primarily use On3, but for now, the notes that I have are primarily on 24/7 Sports. But Illinois signed 5 composite 4-star prospects, which was the most since 2009. And Lovie Smith, his entire 5-year tenure, was only able to get 4 of those guys. And granted, it's a totally different age in terms of when Lovie Smith was recruiting versus when Bret Bielema is right now. But I think those kind of bullet points is indicative of how far Illinois has gone in the past couple of years in terms of being relatively consistent again, building some energy, and building some excitement, most importantly, because a lot of people, including myself, kind of went into the season thinking, man, Illinois can be this year's kind of Indiana, except Illinois primarily has strengths on the defensive side of the ball. So it's almost like the roles are flipped in terms of Indiana's identity versus Illinois' identity, because the one thing Illinois does have going for them is that linebacker room is just so freaking impressive, and just guys who swarm all over the football field. They don't miss too many tackles, and for the most part, they play relatively disciplined and really don't have too many turnovers. But the good news is, if you're an Illinois fan, you really truly have a lot to look forward to. And I think for the most part, I don't have their 26 schedule on top of me, but I have to imagine if you can find a way to avoid Ohio State, for example, and you'll probably have to play Michigan, but I would imagine you're probably going to have a little bit more of a favorable schedule this year. You do have some young guys who are coming back, even though it's Illinois has kind of been more of a senior heavy team, at least for the past 2 seasons now. But you're gonna have to find yourself a quarterback. You're gonna have to find yourself another number one receiver since Hank Beatty is a senior. And I think the offensive line is have to gonna be completely retouched here because they just definitely had a lot of moments. They definitely struggled a little bit, but at the same time too, you have to be excited about what you see from Illinois. The in-state recruiting is on point, and most importantly is that they're remaining competitive in games that they certainly have the capability of being able to do. And as long as they kind of put that together, they continue to get better with the offensive line, which also they're able to poach Micah Smith from UCLA, a 4-star kid, for example. That's a huge get for them if you're Illinois. And I think from Illinois, you're also going to see more of a JUCO presence for them, especially when Illinois is kind of in that middle ground between not necessarily competing directly against Ohio State and the Michigans of the world, but you don't necessarily have enough in-state talent to be able to compete with those teams just head on if you're just focusing all in-state recruiting. So I think that's kind of the catch-22 you have to find with that, because you have to be able to get those top 10 guys within the state, or at least 5 of them. But you also have to kind of sit there and say, well, are we going to out recruit Ohio State and Michigan states? No. But can we find guys in Wisconsin and Minnesota and some other neighboring states who would be willing to come over and want to play in the Big Ten? Absolutely. And I think you're seeing that in the most part when they're targeting a lot of JUCO guys. Like, for example, they have another 3-star kid in Alfred Washington who they kind of prepared on getting. And I think one of the issues that Illinois had before Bret Bielema was they were trying way too hard to be battling the group of 6 programs, whereas what they really should be doing is, of course, staying in the relative pipelines that you have, but trying to focus on those 3 and 4-star kids that, for the most part, are really getting overlooked, and the Ohio States and the Michigans of the world aren't really willing to develop. But let me know in the comments what you think about Illinois this year. But I think you have to be pretty proud about what you saw and pretty happy about it. But I think Bret Bielema is one hell of a coach, and I think you're going to continue to see that.